What? How come?
Hi there, everyone. Lars and Scott back for another Dandadan review brought to you by Camille's Harem. Not just a podcast for novice writers by novice writers, but also a YouTube channel by novice writers for novice writers. Because writing is an adventure, it's more fun with friends. And though we know that Dandadan has concluded the first half of its first season, and we are a little bit late with this, we still wanted to come back and discuss the last episode because, wow, that was some crazy fun.
It left us on quite the cliffhanger. And with all of the stuff we've seen with Dandadan up to this point, the fact that, and this is one of the biggest things that's like kind of boggling at the moment, because I don't know what's coming. I haven't read the manga this far. What's boggling my mind is that it's slowing down to give us a lot of these like eerie, I wouldn't quite call them world building moments because like there's a lot of mystery, but it's giving us a lot of information that we don't fully understand yet. And because of that, it's setting up for something big. And from everything you've said, Lars, this is going to be one hell of a ride once it starts really going.
Yeah, this is going to be incredible. All of this has been the build up to what we're going to just jump into when the series picks up again. And so for some people who are like, this feels like it kind of was a bit of a letdown. Like, sure, we got that cliffhanger. They discovered that there is another room. They're like, but really, it doesn't feel like it's quite the massive cliffhanger. Au contraire. If any of you know anything about summertime rendering or know your Higurashi, you should realize that we just got slapped around with some really spooky stuff. But before we dive into that, let's just do a quick review of the main events of this episode, and then we'll dive right on into why this episode leaves us just feeling like, woo, good little spine-tingling goodness. So this episode mostly covers the journey of Momo, Okarun, and Gigi on out to the village where Gigi's parents have been renting a home. Gigi's father is, I'm forgetting the term for someone who studies volcanoes. So I'm just going to say volcanologist. There we go. So he's a volcanologist, which works out really well because, hey, there's a volcano right there. However, being in the home that they've been renting out has caused all kinds of serious problems. Gigi is now haunted by some weird figure who's stalking him. His parents have had something horrible happen to them, and all of the exorcists and spiritualists and authorities on all things supernatural who've gone to the house have had horrible things happen to them as a result. A lot of it resulting in people offing themselves. So for grandma to now send these three kids to the house to check it out, that is just like, wait, what, Seiko? What do you want these kids to do? And a lot of the horror actually takes a back seat at first because we have this long ride by train on out to the village, and this is a chance for Okarun and Gigi to actually start getting to know each other a little bit. But it first comes off as a big rivalry matchup. They're both jockeying for Momo's time and attention and affection, and they both know how to grab it. Gigi's got that connection, being the childhood friend. He's got all the cool stuff. He's the sporty kid. And Okarun's got all of the crazy, weird alien occult stuff that he can pull out that he knows that Momo is interested in. And as they're jockeying for attention, it ends up with them kind of bonding a little bit because Gigi's like, oh, that's so cool. I want to know more. And Okarun's like, oh, this guy's a little bit different than what I thought. They get to the town. There's something weird about the town, but who cares about that when you have to climb the entire mountain, apparently, up these really narrow stairs to get to the house? I just want to know how they got the furniture up there.
That is a big question, especially for me, because it's like, all right, this house is at the top of this hill where a shrine is supposed to be. You've even got like the torii gates and like the crazy stairs leading up to it. And it's this like newly built looking Western style house instead of like the more traditional Buddhist or Shinto shrine. And it's really bizarre that it's there. Like it seems like a regular enough house when you look at it, but it's just the placement of where it is one of the first things that catches you off guard with this. Like, not to mention all of the stuff leading through the village, the Hot Springs village, leading up to it. Like, you look at the really creepy villagers, you look at the fact that it's a hot springs village that should be a major tourist attraction, and there's barely anybody there. Like, that was another major red flag, like, leading into this. It's just eerie.
Yeah, so much about this place just seems wrong. And it's hard to tell how much of this the teenagers are really taking in. Momo has shown to us by now that she's pretty observant. However, unfortunately, she doesn't fully utilize those powers of observation, which leads to part of the ending of this episode. But she decides, after they've gotten themselves settled into the house that just feels like it shouldn't belong there, she excuses herself to go into town. She's going to go check out these hot springs, and leaves Okarun and Gigi to their own devices. And it's so funny watching them play soccer, because it's very clear that Okarun is not very athletic. But there he is, playing a little bit of soccer with Gigi, as they're now competing once again about how close they are to Momo. Gigi recognizes that Okarun's got some feelings for her, and we've got some fun little embarrassing bits going on, especially when Okarun's all like, "Oh, I win because I've kissed her," but he doesn't say that, and it leaves Gigi hanging like, "Now, no, how do you win? Tell me, how do you beat me, the cool childhood friend?" Well, we cut on over to Momo, and Momo's there in the hot springs enjoying herself when a bunch of really creepy older guys show on up and get into the hot spring with her. And you realize, oh, this is a co-ed a hot spring. The sign was all rusted. It's not been well taken care of. And these guys come in for the attack, and they catch her off guard. So Momo's in a really tight spot as the episode comes to its end, with then Gigi and Okarun realizing that there's really something else off about the house. They've been inside. They know the basic they know the basic proportions of the interior, but there seems to be an extra room that should not be there. And so they go in, they check the wall, break through the wall, and discover a confinement space with tons of seals all over it. This thing is absolutely coated in seals, and they've just broken open something that they probably shouldn't have. And they're completely cut off from Momo. They have no idea what's happening to her, as she's up against these guys all alone. And now we are kind of clued into what might be happening inside of this creepy house that's been killing people. Bam, bam, bam. That's the end of the first half of the season.
So one thing, and this is something I'm just barely picking up, because we talked about this before we started recording, but I just barely picked it up. Every single like fight and crazy thing that's happened up to this point, it's been Momo and Okarun together. I mean, and there's been other characters thrown in, but it's been Momo and Okarun together dealing with the issues. Those two have been separated. They are not near each other as this stuff is going down. And they're going to have to get creative to deal with the crazy stuff that's going to happen from this point. And I think it's going to be good, because we're going to see more of their character traits coming out as they're having to deal with it. Momo with her like observation skills and her psychic abilities and dealing with that kind of stuff. And Okarun with like not just the Turbo Granny stuff, but like I honestly think his knowledge of like all of the occult stuff that he knows about is going to be a major asset into what's coming. So I think this is going to be very interesting going into this. So you mentioned summertime rendering, and I am seriously getting like from this like isolated hot spring village compared to summertime renderings, like idyllic tourist island kind of feel. It has a similar vibe going into this. There's this location doesn't seem right in so many different ways, and there's a deeper, creepy, very eerie mystery that we're just barely seeing the outside of. And as we get more and more into this arc, we're gonna we're going to have a lot of reveals. There's going to be a lot of information that's going to be crammed down our throats as we go into this.
Oh yeah. So looking ahead to what the next season has to offer up, it's going to be wild and explosive. But you can't have those kinds of moments and have them really land without the proper buildup. And
Mm-hmm.
this episode really does deliver a lot of that buildup. So you've got as you point out, you have the hot springs town, which should be a massive tourist attraction. But bless you. But it's not only not well attended, it seems like it's falling apart. It's
Mm-hmm.
like the hot springs that Momo goes to, it's not well kept up. What the heck
Yeah.
is going on here? You have a modern Western style home over by a Tory gate beyond it, where you'd expect a more traditional shrine like house, or just a straight up shrine. And what on earth is that doing there with a creepy room that shouldn't exist? Like in real life, there are plenty of buildings where you realize at a certain point that the proportions are not quite right. And when that happens, it always gives you kind of like that little feeling of like, what did they hide in this building? What's up? There's a woman with a shotgun, or at least with a rifle, something like that, who has a gun out there in the open, who's in the background. You're like, that's not normal for
Well,
Japan.
and just like pointing out the woman with the shotgun, like you see some of these other villagers and they have the same creepy look on their face. But you look at the woman, like she doesn't quite have the same face. She has the shotgun. She's with this group, but not of this group. And so, like, she stands out from that group. And so she's going to play a pretty important role, at least from what I can see later on.
There's a lot of visual stuff that is happening in this episode that I think that for the Japanese audience, I think that they are more likely to recognize what's off and what isn't. But if you're willing to spend your time with this episode, you begin to realize that there's a lot of things that are not quite right.
Yeah.
And this episode also does deliver some little background details that might become important later on as the story unfolds. That's something that we've already seen, that whenever they talk about things regarding the occult or with aliens, it's going to come into play somehow, maybe just not in the way that we expect it to. So this episode's doing a load of heavy lifting. I think like the one thing that is a gamble is that for such a heavy lifting episode, that it's left as a cliffhanger rather than just guiding us immediately into the next episode. So that'll be interesting to see how people react once we get back into Dandadan. But as far as progressing the story and building up the spookiness that this next arc deservedly should have, it did well.
Yeah, no, it did very well. And like, it's done what it's always done throughout the story. Like, you've got a lot of that eerie, like, exposition and world building, all of this, like, new information we're being exposed to. But it's counterpointed, like, constantly by the character shenanigans of these three characters as they're interacting with each other. You've got Okarun, like, trying to break out of his shell, trying to be somebody he isn't, just to impress Momo because he feels like threatened in that sense. You've got Momo, who's just going along because Granny told her to, and is ready to take charge, and EG, who is covering a lot of trauma, like a lot of trauma. And so, like, having them interact, yeah, that poor kid, having them like interact with each other, like goofing off like they always would leading into this, it's pretty interesting. I think it's a shame they're not reading EG into like the dirty jokes, but it's funny, like, either way that he keeps bringing up. He's like, y'all have issues, don't you? And then he starts trying to play along with them.
I'll say this as like a very, very light spoiler. Like, I'm not really giving away anything major with this. That their tendency to not let him in on the dirty jokes rolls over to a bunch of other characters, which leads to some really hilarious setups.
Okay.
And so like it gets even more bonkers and funny because they refuse to elaborate or explain why talking about Okarune's balls and even somehow right just saying testicles but never elaborating is just there in the open.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I like about this episode in terms of the interactions between the characters is how Gigi and Okarune end up really coming together. Like you can see that there's a good budding friendship between the two of them. Yeah, sure, they're rivals for Momo, but as they're talking, you realize that Gigi, like he may be the cool kid, but he's laid back. He doesn't see Okarune as a big threat. And Okarune is just getting out of a shell. He's not coming from this perspective of I'm the nice guy who was owed Momo. And stabby, get rid of this guy. Like neither of them have any weird yandere tendencies floating amongst them. There's something kind of pure about these two oddballs getting thrown in together that as they start communicating and spending time with each other, they realize that while they're very different, that doesn't mean that there's no reason for them to get along. And I like that. That's a very positive representation of friendship. Something that we need to see more of in fiction, in my opinion.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Yeah, we've definitely talked about that a lot, like throughout the entire history of Camille's harem, about like how having positive friendships between characters is something a lot of stories miss out on. And like we talk a lot about like girls getting together and having like positive actual friendships is something that we miss out on. But like just anybody, honestly, having those friendships, I think it's a big deal. And you lose a lot of like your possible like story interactions by not including that kind of stuff, because like yeah, friends don't always agree with each other. That's a potential form of drama you can include in your story. But like having like what's a better positive way to end the story is like those friends getting back together, overcoming their differences, learning how to solve the challenges that they're both like butting heads over. That's a very positive way to end the story. So why not have that?
And also, I think just a good positive representation of people from different social corners, with like, where you have the nerd hanging out with the jock, and sure, like that's something that we've seen plenty of times where the nerd and jocks can get along, but in this case, rather than it's all like you're a nerd, I'm a jock, we're so different, but really we're not all that different. In this case, it is the nerd and the jock coming together because of a girl. And normally you would expect like, oh, the rage, the betrayal, the feelings, the angst. And instead it comes off as funny and wholesome. And that's because like, at least with guys, is that like, and granted, this is me kind of getting a little bit into stereotypes right here, but I've been around the dating scene long enough. It's more likely for two guys who are interested in the same girl to actually become friends, so long as they're not being jerks, as opposed to two girls who are interested in the same guy becoming friends. It can happen, but it's more likely for it to happen with guys, and I like seeing that right here. And it elevates Gigi, because especially for so many of just like the anime only fans coming into this, so many people really dislike Gigi. Like when we did our video talking about like the humor that the show has brought in, everything, about half of the comments were Gigi's not funny, I don't like him. And I'm just all like, oh boy, just you wait. And I think that this episode does some good for making Gigi way more sympathetic to the audience.
Yeah.
Because he's not just the love rival. He's the cool guy. He's a good guy. And he's someone who can be a good friend for Okarune.
This one was definitely more of a build-up, setup episode, if anything. I love the character interactions. They were top-notch, as always. But what mattered most was just, like, looking at all of the individual little, like, details that's going on. So, like, my advice when the anime comes back around, when is this coming back around?
In the summer.
In the summer. Okay, so not too far. So when it comes back around the summer, rewatch this episode because it's going to make a big difference, like noticing all of these details again before you launch into what's going to happen next.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah, it's a bit of an odd choice to have a setup episode be the cliffhanger, but this will work, especially for what I know of the upcoming arc.
I think, honestly, in my opinion, I think they were so focused on getting like all this other stuff in, and they did a fantastic job that just pacing wise, this is where they had to end it. They weren't able to like stick everything in, but leaving cliffhanger is not a bad idea. I think it's a good setup to like keep people interested in the story into the next cur of the anime. But otherwise, yeah, they were so focused on getting the other stuff into the show that like this is just kind of tacked on to the end to like get everything set up for the next part.
There is one last thing actually that I think that we should quickly address.
Okay.
So the show has come to a pause with Momo getting attacked in the hot springs. This feels very reminiscent of when the aliens went to impregnate her in the pilot. So I understand, like, there's some people like, oh, this is just so uncomfortable. And I'm like, I get it. And I think that, again, we've talked about this in the past. Like, if you don't like it, then that's okay. You don't have to like it. We're not here to convince you of it. However, this is a show that has shown that if it is going to touch on that material, it's going to treat it seriously, but also the characters thus far have never been driven to a point that would be overly compromising. This isn't Heavenly Delusion where you're like, oh no, when you get to the end of the show. And so for people who find this to be like a bit too much, think back to what happened in the pilot and who is a character who has something who's tied to women in distress, or specifically to young girls in distress. And if you haven't read the manga, that's okay, but that's something to look. That's something to keep in mind for how the show will pick up. Because when I went back to reread this arc, I was impressed with how details from the early parts of the series come back in some really cool ways for what's currently happening with Momo.
I'm looking forward to it. Awesome.
So with all that being said, hope that you guys have been enjoying Dandadan. Sure, we've got to wait about half a year for it to come back, but it will be worth it so long as they keep on adapting the show as faithfully as they have been doing. And if you've enjoyed the reviews and the breakdowns that we've been doing for Dandadan, then I hope that you guys will enjoy how we approach the Apothecary Diaries, because Scott and I will be teaming up to talk about that show once it starts premiering. So make sure that you have subscribed to Camille's Harem, that you hit the bell notifications. That way you'll be notified for when those videos come out. And we're looking forward to that. So that being said, we'll catch you guys in the next video. And until then, juice.
Okini.